Good evening, everyone. My name is Nathan Godliman, and I'm the rabbi of the South London Liberal Synagogue. It is my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, although to many of you, he needs no introduction. My president at South London, Louise Friedman, remembers the night that Charles was born, for example. Rabbi Dr. Charles Middleburgh is a lifelong liberal Jew who has served communities across England, Wales, Ireland, and Denmark. Yes, Denmark. Harrow and Wembley Progressive, Dublin Progressive, Cardiff Reform, and Copenhagen. He is an experienced and respected congregational rabbi, yet he is so much more besides. Wildlife photographer, book lover and reviewer, poet, I'm going to wave one or two titles, liturgist, I'll wave a mahsul, preacher, scholar, teacher, well, here's some scholarly material, and I was expecting Charles to be talking about the prophets tonight, but he's not. He's talking about Psalms. Chief executive of the Liberal Movement at one point, and director of Jewish Studies and dean at the Leo Baecker College, last in a by no means exhaustive list. Charles has been a constant at the college for several decades and can be seen in numerous photographs of graduating classes, including my own. Indeed, it was at the Leo Baecker College where I first met Rav Chaz, as I soon came to call him, a term of endearment which he embraced and even had printed on the side of a mug. Charles conducted the interview on religion and spirituality. Candidates are interviewed over a series of days on multiple topics, and it was then that I knew I was in the right place. I don't know what it was exactly, but at the end of the interview, I had an urge to hug Charles. As a very English Jew, Charles too, we made do with a two-handed handshake. Hugs were not absent in the 5 years to follow, however, as we shared each other's highs and lows. Charles is more than a teacher to his students. He is a friend whose door is always open and whose companionship across a long program of study, starting each day in the room of prayer with Shacharit, is valued so highly by so many. Indeed, Charles has probably ordained more rabbis than anyone else. I was number 12, and I believe there have been 4 more since. Did he score a hat trick last year? I think he did. That's a lot of rabbis, and it is a testament to the man. One of Charles's great loves in terms of Judaism is or are the prophets of Israel. However, tonight he's going to be speaking about the Psalms and how the Psalms inspire LJ values. Therefore, without further ado, our friend and teacher, Charles Middleburgh.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm somewhat overwhelmed by what you've just said. I'm glad you read accurately the script that I gave you beforehand. I also want to say, just by way of reciprocation for everybody, that as 1 or 2 of you know, my late mother was ill for many years with dementia. And on the day I was called to her bedside with her death imminent, I was on my own and I knew I needed to take someone with me. And I knew immediately who that person was, and that was Nathan Godliman. And he accompanied me at that incredibly powerful and sad and liberating moment. And it's one of the ties that binds us together and will bind us together until one of us pops our clogs, which I hope won't be for a very, very long time. Thank you, all of you who are here, the people I know and those I don't. I'm talking about the Psalms tonight because although I teach the prophets, as Nathan said, at Leo Baecker College, the Psalms are an absolutely wonderful series of Hebrew poems. And I just love to read them simply for the pleasure of reading them. But I was also asked to think about why they chime with liberal Jewish values, which of course, if you consider the context of the Psalms as being in the temple, you'll realize is a little bit of a stretch. But I think possibly I've come up with a suitable response, hopefully. And I will happily take questions when I've basically either run dry or decided you've heard more than enough from me and I need to hear something of you. So before I start, let me just say a little bit about the Psalms. And the first thing, perhaps surprisingly, not about the original, but about translations. I've always said as a teacher of Tanakh at Liabeck College that nobody will be drummed out of school for looking at a text that they need to decipher with the Hebrew and the English. After all, it helps to facilitate proper understanding. And of course, most of us are used to the Jewish Publication Society translation of the Hebrew Bible. The one that I first had, funnily enough, which I realized was originally printed in 1917. That was the one I had for my bar mitzvah in 1969. And then, of course, what we still call the engine of 1985. And that is the translation the brilliant and wonderful text that has been in and Mark Zvi Brettler. But above them, at least in my opinion, it is the translation of the entire Hebrew Bible by Professor Robert Alter. And Robert Alter will go down in Jewish history for his translation in exactly the same way as Moses Mendelssohn did with his. And if any of you are interested in getting not only a work of incredible but very, very approachable scholarship, you will find it in Alter's translation of the books of the Hebrew Bible. It's not a cheap buy, although I suspect it may be cheaper than it was when I originally bought it, but it is worth every penny. And if you're into this sort of thing, you will love it. If you haven't got it, you'll love the translations, but even more, you'll love the introductions to the different books, which are also another expression of his scholarship. So I want to just start by quoting two or three little things from Robert Alter's introduction to the Psalms. So first of all, he sets the context. This is the very first paragraph. Throughout the ages, Psalms has been the most urgently, personally present of all the books of the Bible in the lives of many readers. Both Jewish and Christian tradition made it part of the daily and weekly liturgy. Untold numbers have repeatedly turned to Psalms for encouragement and comfort in times of crisis and joy and despair. The inner world of major Western writers, from Augustine, Judah Halevi, and George Herbert, to Emily Dickinson and Paul Celan, was inflected by the reading of Psalms. Now, we take pride in the Psalms, and we see them as a unique piece of biblical Hebrew literature. So I'm afraid at this point I come on a wrecking ball to smash that comfortable perception to pieces, because many of the Psalms are actually reflections of other Psalms already written in general Semitic culture in the area of the Fertile Crescent. We know that there were Psalms of all kinds used in Mesopotamia from a very early age, Psalms of a recognizable kind used in Egypt, which of course is a very different culture from the Mesopotamian, and also in what we can call Syro-Canaanite, and that stems from the city of Ugarit in Syria, to modern Syria, which was important between about 1400 and 1200 BCE. And there are some real unavoidable parallels, not similarities, but real equivalents in some of these texts. I've always felt that where the Bible was concerned, it actually made it even more incredible that there was this body of literature, this unique body of literature in our tradition. And I find the fact that some of it, if you like, pays literary lip service to similar texts in other cultures, I think is rather wonderful, because our Psalms preserve those Psalms in a way that they would never have been preserved otherwise. One or two things about the Psalms: they are Hebrew poetry. That doesn't mean they're recognizably poetic in a way that we would necessarily use the term poetry, but they definitely are. They're very different from biblical Hebrew prose, and all of them were framed, if you like, in contradistinction to everything that was going on in praise language in other cultures, because they were specifically, powerfully monotheistic, even though there are one or two echoes of polytheism as well. Now, I'm sure another thing that we're all familiar with, you're all familiar with, is the fact that there is this long-held tradition that King David wrote the Psalms. And there are a number of Psalms which are labeled Mizmor le David, a Psalm of David. And there are other Psalms, a number of them have titles, by the way. There are a number of Psalms which have a title which suggests not only that David wrote it, but that he wrote it at a specific time. We don't think that Mizmor le David means that King David wrote that psalm specifically. What we think is that le David in that case means the Davidic monarch, and that would have been the kings of Judah who were seen to be the descendants of King David. One other thing that hopefully won't bore you too much before we actually turn to the texts is just to say that, first of all, the period that they span, the Psalms, probably from the 10th century BCE, at least until the 5th or 4th century BCE, which is a long period of time for a piece of literature to be evolving and developing. And we know that the Psalms are important because in the Christian Bible, the recitation of Psalms is mentioned together with the recitation of the Torah and the prophets. And of course, if you look at if you think about the Christian Bible, particularly the Gospels, the first three, in a different way, you can see them as a reflection of Jewish life in a period that we wouldn't otherwise necessarily have a record for. So the Psalms are already important, and they were certainly very important by Jesus's time, and probably canonized, that is to say, in the form more or less in which we have them now, by the 4th century of the current era, before the Christian era, the current era. And that is one of the things that is still debated. How late do they go? There are one or two Psalms which are deemed to have Maccabean origin, but that is still debated. And I suppose the other thing that we need to remind ourselves of where the Psalms are concerned is that they came out of a very ancient context. They were used in the context of temple worship. And that means that they were used in ceremonies which included sacrifices. All know about sacrifices, the sacrifice of animals, and so on. But we as liberal Jews who have long eschewed, if not acted in a horrified way about the whole sacrificial cult in ancient Judaism, may be a little bit disappointed to know that some of them would have been said in the context of the sacrifice of animals. On the other hand, you can say that the sacrifice of animals died out, but the relevance of the Psalms has continued. I'm not going to talk a lot, in fact, really at all, about the precise conventions and literary content of the Psalms, just to say that there were two scholars who from the 19th century, and particularly then into the early 20th, developed theories about the Psalms. And they said that one of the things that was most important when you assessed where they came from was the German term Sitz im Leben. In other words, what was their situation in life? What was the precise context in which they were used? And one of the benefits of looking at them in that way is that we can think ourselves into not just ceremonies at which they might have been used, and there are a number of suggestions, but we can also, and I particularly remember my beloved teacher and mentor, John Rayner, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, saying that they were a soundtrack from temple days, and particularly when you could see antiphonal readings, that is to say, a priest would say part and then the congregation would say part, very much like the responsive reading that we're used to. And I've always felt very much moved by that thought, that the responsive reading so loved of liberal Jews has a very, very ancient pedigree. So what about the Psalms and liberal values? This is a much, much more difficult thing to address because, of course, liberal values, the idea of liberal values, very subjective though they are even now, would have been completely impossible for the ancients to comprehend because that wasn't their purpose. For me, what makes the Psalms so powerful is that most of them are incredibly human documents. Now, that may sound like a ridiculous statement to the obvious. Of course, they're human documents. They were written by people. But what I mean is that the Psalms it's not a corpus of wonderful, high-flown, beautiful, perfect poetry that is sort of on another realm from the one which we inhabit. Far, far from it. They're really down to earth, many of them. They address the human condition. Some of them, of course, praise God. Some of them give thanks to God, the Thanksgiving Psalms. But others are bitter laments, cries of pain of people who were suffering terribly and cried out to God, and somehow or other that text and texts became ritualized, so that there were psalms for almost every occasion. There are 150 psalms in the Tanakh, and from a quite early stage, so 6th, 5th century, certainly by the 4th BCE, they were divided into 5 books. I mean, there are 150 psalms, but if you look at the book, you'll see there's book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, and book 5. Obviously, in imitation of the Torah and its 5 books, which of course makes us realize that those 5 books of Psalms would only have been conceptualized in that way if they had been felt to be equivalent in importance to the 5 books of Torah. And that again is something that we don't necessarily pick up. Now, I'm going to give you a list of Psalms that I think it's worth looking at. I'm going to pick out 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of them, but I won't have time to do all of them because I also want to hear from you. So I'm going to give you this list, and here goes. If you want to write them down, feel free. 1, 2, 8, 10, 12, 19, 22, 49, 69, 78, 95, 102, 124, and 137. And I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about one or two of these psalms, because I've always felt that to be a liberal Jew was to be grounded. It wasn't to be fanciful about life. It was to have one's feet firmly placed on the ground. And the Psalms are real in that way. They talk about real people's experience. Of course, in a, well, perhaps secular age that's reached its apogee, or maybe secular age that's increasing, some of the terminology we don't easily get our heads around, but others speak to the human condition regardless of time and place and so on. The first psalm of all, it's really quite short, it's only 6 verses, and it starts, tweak my Tanakh over here, it starts with the word Ashrei, but it's not that Ashrei that we do, it's a slightly different one. It says, Ashrei ha'ish asher lo halach ba'atzat reshaim. Blessed is the man, or happy is the man, who has not followed the advice of bad people. And if as liberal Jews we do anything, we are skeptical about simple solutions, which are often malevolent and misguided. And it goes on rather beautifully to talk about God's teaching being a delight. And if you study, you become, he says, like a tree planted beside streams of water, which yields its fruit in due season. It's a lovely image, the idea that by imbibing into ourselves Torah, we become fruitful, we give out to other people. And I've always thought that being a liberal Jew was about not being a passenger. It was about making a contribution to life in general, to seeing one's role as being out there, not just inside the community and the synagogue. Now, in Psalm number 2, I put it there because one of my favorite verses in the whole book is here. Everybody knows, you all know, Ivdu et Adonai b'simcha, bo'u lefanav birnana. Worship the Eternal One with gladness, come into God's presence with singing. But what fewer know is that in Psalm 2, verse 11, that phrase is turned on its head rather wonderfully. It says, Ivdu et Adonai b'yir'ah, worship God in awe or terror, v'gilu bir'adah, and rejoice in terror. We know from Torah that being in the presence of God, as with Aaron's sons Nadav and Avihu, could be fatal. And there's a warning here, I think, that we need to mind our P's and Q's, that we don't, as it were, walk sloppily into the presence of the Almighty. We think very much about where we are, and we take that very seriously indeed. Now, if you look at Psalm 8, you have one of those great paeans of praise of God, Adonai Adonenu ma'adir shimcha b'chol haaretz. Eternal One, our God, how magnificent is your name in all the earth. Asher tenahodcha al hashamayim. And this is all about God's part of creation and all of the aspects of creation. And as a lifelong, very committed environmentalist and conservationist, I also see that very much as a liberal Jewish value. And it's a text that I find very much reinforces all of the things that I believe. But as I said, the Psalms are not always comfortable. They don't always make us feel good. So if you look at Psalm 12, for example, you'll find an urgent plea to God to help the faithful because they are suffering. And then it talks about people speaking lies to one another. Their speech is smooth. They talk with duplicity. And it then says in language that perhaps we find a little bit uncomfortable, Yachret Adonai kol siftei chalakot. May the Eternal cut off all flattering lips, every tongue that speaks arrogance. And I'm afraid I can't read that without thinking about modern politicians and the necessity of challenging those politicians, not, of course, by cutting their lips off. That's really a rather distasteful image, but certainly verbally by standing up to them. And so as we progress through, bearing in mind that the length of different psalms varies massively from a few verses to well over 100, we come to Psalm 19, which is again one of the ones that we know from the liturgy. Hashamayim mesaprim kavod ma'aseh yadav magid harakia. The heavens declare the glory of God. Wonderful, wonderful phraseology. Day to day makes utterance. Night to night speaks out. There is no utterance. There are no words whose sound goes unheard. Their voice carries throughout the earth. Their words to the end of the world. And the work that reforming Jews have done with Jewish liturgy to make sure that the words we speak, the words we hear, really resonate with us. And of course, that is the psalm that has the phrase, the series of verses that we all know from our Torah service on Shabbat, Torat Adonai Timima Meshivat Nafesh. The teaching of the Eternal is perfect, renewing the soul. Psalm 22, you will remember probably from RE in school, some of us. Psalm 22 is also called Mizmor LeDavid, a Davidic psalm, and it begins, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. My God, why have you abandoned me? Or perhaps in the phraseology that some of us remember from the King James Bible, forsaken me, a phrase allegedly quoted by Jesus on the cross. And all of us who know those two phrases, those two opening phrases, don't necessarily know the rest of the psalm. And the rest of the psalm is really, really interesting. And of course, some of these texts have been given a Christological interpretation, which Jews wouldn't necessarily be 100% comfortable with, but which nevertheless is there because it's part of the Judeo-Christian heritage. I'm not going to say anything about Psalm 23 because Psalm 23 is so much a part of all of us on so many different occasions. So I'm going to rush ahead, well, not rush, but I'm going to move ahead to Psalm 49. Now, Psalm 49 like other psalms, begins Lamanatseach, which there are a number of theories about what that means, but let's say to the choir master, Livnei Korach, to the sons of Korach, Mizmor, a psalm. And just to say that there are a lot of titles to the psalms, and one of the things we know from extracts like Livnei Korach, of the sons of Korach, is that there were different choirs, that different groups of priests had duty at different times in the temple, and there were different choirs. And so psalms were written, some of them for precise choirs, and those titles therefore preserve that little bit of history. Again, Psalm 49, wonderful, wonderful phraseology. In verse 6, in time of trouble, why should I fear the encompassing evil of those who would supplant me? Men who trust in their riches, who glory in their great wealth. It cannot redeem a person or pay their ransom to God. The price of life is too high, and so one ceases to be forever. It's a reminder that we shouldn't judge people simply by their attainments, let alone their wealth, because ultimately, as it says in the liturgy for Yizkor in our Machzor Ruach Hadashah, we can't take it with us. Whatever it has, we go out of the world exactly as we came into the world, with nothing. Now, one of the series of psalms that is particularly adored are the psalms in the 70s, that is to say, those that are from Psalm 70 to 79. And of those, I want to just draw your attention to Psalm 78. And the reason I want to draw your attention to it, and equally the reason why I'm not going to read it, is because it has 72 verses. But those 72 verses are a history lesson. They are all about, particularly, the Exodus from Egypt, but not just the Exodus from Egypt. And it's a reminder that sometimes in a liturgical context, it's important to us to give a sense of our history. And again, as liberal Jews on Yom Kippur, when we have our Musaf service, our additional service, you'll remember there is a section of history. It's very poetically phrased and described, but it is about history, and it culminates in that great description of Ben Sira, of the high priest in the temple on Yom Kippur. So history psalms are very, very important. Psalm 90, a prayer of Moses, Ish Elohim, the man of God, very famous, very well known. We use it at funeral services because it talks about the fragility and temporary nature of life. It's another one that is well worth reading. I'm not going to say anything about Psalm 92 because we know it. It's the Shabbat Psalm, and most of the Psalms in the 90s get used in liturgy very regularly. I have to admit to a preference in the Psalms of the 90s to Psalm 95. L'chu neranena l'Adonai, naria l'tzu yishenu. Come, let us sing joyously to the Eternal, raise a shout for our rock and redeemer. There's a little bit of history in there too, but it's all about wholehearted, enthusiastic praise. And sometimes, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I go to synagogue, I don't actually want to hear angst-ridden questioning. I actually want to hear something that's a little bit more certain and a little bit more emphatic. And a psalm like this certainly would put you in the right frame of mind. Now, Psalm 102 has one of the longest titles of any of the Psalms. And it says, Tefillah le'ani ki ya'atof, v'lifnei Adonai yishpoch sicho, which means a prayer of a poor individual who is fainting and who pours out before God his words, his plaint, sicho. And it's a reminder to us that prayer is a very important aspect of our lives. Over many decades of reading the writings of the founders of liberal Judaism, one of the things that is incontrovertible is the fact that they were people of deep faith. And these texts would have spoken to them very, very powerfully. We who have gone through the theological disturbance and disruption that was inevitably and quite correctly caused by the Shoah are now in a different era where pouring out one's words to God when one feels down and alone is not something that requires a great exercise in concentration, but is something that appeals to more of us as being a natural thing. And if you feel that spontaneous prayer is not something that you would be able to manage, and that applies to most of us, the Psalms are there, and you will find something in the Psalms that not just speaks to you, but speaks for you as well. So before I stop and let you speak and ask any questions that you may have, I just want to single out two more Psalms. Psalm 124 is one of the Shirei HaMa'alot. Now, of course, we all know 121, Esainai, etc. But 124 is not that well known, but it is a statement of great truth. I'm going to read it in its English translation. Were it not for the Eternal who was on our side, let Israel now declare, were it not for the Eternal who was on our side, when people assailed us, they would have swallowed us alive in their burning rage against us. The waters would have carried us off. The torrent would have swept over us. Over us would have swept the seething waters. Blessed is the Eternal, who did not let us be ripped apart by their teeth. We are like a bird escaped from the fowler's trap. The trap broke, and we escaped. Our help is the name of the Eternal, maker of heaven and earth. 8 little verses, but incredibly powerful. You know that some of the Psalms that we include in our liberal liturgies are excerpts. There are texts that are uncomfortable that we leave out. And there are 2 different schools of thought on that. John Rayner was of the view that the Psalms should be beautiful in the way in which they were in our liturgy. My teacher, colleague, and friend, Rabbi Professor Jonathan Maganet, who is responsible for most of the modern liturgies of the Reform movement, says it's good to leave the things that are uncomfortable because they make us uncomfortable. And that's a healthy thing. I'm kind of in the middle between the two, and the perfect example of a psalm that you would have real qualms about is Psalm 137, the last one on my list. Now, Psalm 23, Psalm 121, Psalm 90, 102 we might say they are the best known Psalms. But I would suggest that Psalm 137 is probably even more engraved on many hearts, even of liberal Jews. Al Neharot Bavel, Sham Yashavnu, Gam Bachinu, Bezochrenu et Zion. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung up our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of the eternal on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. You think about the thousands of years of perceived exile, when that phrase, Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, tishkach yamini, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. It's an encapsulation of a period of life and thought when our ancestors believed that they could not pray to God in a land that was not their own, because in those days people believed that gods were land bound. If you had an idol who was your chief deity and you went off on a military campaign, you took the idol with you because otherwise the idol wouldn't be able to protect you. Similarly, until the incomparably great prophet Jeremiah came on the scene, the God of Israel was exactly that, restricted to Judea, to Israel and Judah. And this psalm expresses the view before the prophet Jeremiah told the exiles how to look at things very, very differently. But never mind. We love this psalm, or at least we love verses 1 to 5, because 1 to 6, sorry, because verses 7, 8, and 9 are of a completely different hue. And they say, remember, Eternal, the Edomites in the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried, strip her to her very foundations. Fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us, a blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, we don't have those verses in our liturgy, and that's not just we liberal Jews, it's everybody, because they are extraordinarily uncomfortable and open to malicious reinterpretation. But in a way, they epitomize the very real, the visceral nature of many of the Psalms. They are, taken in the round, a magnificent expression of over 1,000 years, not just of spirituality, but of human experience. And I think that's why they still resonate with us. And my only regret, even though my chosen biblical speciality is the prophets rather than the Psalms, nevertheless, one of my great regrets is that the Psalms are not used as much as they could be, not just in a liturgical context, but in an educational one as well. So that's me. Thank you for listening. And I can only see a few of you, so I can't see all the other people who've fallen asleep or left or whatever. But if any of you have any comments that you want to make or any questions that you want to ask, please feel free. And Nathan will moderate, I'm sure.
I will, and I can see everybody. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand or your virtual hand. And if you're unable to express a question verbally, you're welcome to put something in chat and I will do it on your behalf. Who's going to kick us off? That's David Goldberg. David, don't forget to unmute everyone as well.
Well, thank you, Charles. It was a great pleasure and a privilege to listen to the erudition, to the interpretations. It was such a revelation to hear you interpret the Psalms and take us through them with such aplomb. It was glorious, really absolutely glorious. Referring to the last Psalm, or was it the last or the second last?
Which one?
I'm not sure. But the taking of idols, was it the taking of idols? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Does that have any connection with the story of Laban and Rebecca when she steals his idols and takes them off with Jacob to Canaan, and he pursues them in his train? Is there a connection there?
I don't think there is actually, David, and lovely to see you and Carla. I don't think it actually is connected, but one of the things that follows on from what you've said is that, and I didn't quote them because there wasn't time, some of the Psalms deliberately ridicule the deities, the idols of surrounding countries. And if you remember in the Psalms of the Hallel Psalms 113 to 118, the psalmist really takes pot shots and ridicules those who believe that idols can help them. Pe lahem velo yedaberu, the text says. They have mouths, but they cannot speak, ears, but they cannot hear, and so on. So that is certainly a vein of thinking in some of the Psalms, but not, I think, specifically with that connection. But a good point to raise.
No, thank you.
And we have a question from Zoe.
Hi, Charles. I thought it was quite interesting. I should perhaps say that my maiden name was Trevor Charles, and I was in your confirmation class at when you were at Kingston.
Yeah, long time ago. Yes.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I was following actually in the Holy Scriptures, but as you were explaining about the Psalms, and the translation there obviously is quite different, and I think it's really interesting to see how translations have changed over time, and the words are quite different in places.
Yes,
how things have been translated.
Of course, translation is it's a fickle friend, because sometimes it's brilliant and it gives you the meaning, but at other times, as the Jewish Publication Society epitomizes, there are plenty of places where it doesn't really understand at all. And you find, and I've actually just purely coincidentally got a phrase which my students and I enjoy laughing at whenever it comes up, is meaning of Hebrew uncertain. Well, of course, if the meaning of Hebrew is uncertain, you can be as creative as you like, but there are ways of getting a little bit closer to what the original might have been. But of course, every translation is an interpretation, regardless of the language, and particularly with the Hebrew Bible. It's one of the reasons I have to say that I really admire and respect Robert Alter's great work, because he sets out early on his motivation, and his motivation is to translate as true as possible the Hebrew text. And so he'll do things like, if there's a pun in the Hebrew text, he'll replicate it with an English pun. And it may not be the precise translation of the Hebrew words, but it will convey the essence of them. I'm about to go on sabbatical from the Abet College for 6 months, and I'm going to be diving into all of the scholarly literature about the prophets that I haven't had time to read over the last 30 years. And one of the things that I've been doing recently, just in between times, is I've been reading the prophets through in their original language. And it is extraordinary the degree to which the real meaning of some of the words differs from what the translations say. So I suppose every translation should have the warning, the health warning, caveat emptor, because you've got to be a good Hebraist to know when you're being taken up the translator's garden path, I think. So it's an encouragement to everybody to achieve a level of Hebrew expertise. But if you don't have the time for that, or indeed the inclination, and why should you, use Robert Alter's translation. It's as good as any you can get.
Giles, would you mind giving the full reference, or as full a reference as you can, for the Robert Alter? That's a request from Norman, please.
I will, but you'll get, I'll do it just before the end, because I'm going to have to actually get up and go and get it. But if Norman, it was you, was it? Who? Yes. If you put Robert Alter into Amazon or the book depository or wherever you buy online books for, it will come up. It's 3 volumes, and effectively it's the complete work. It's a lot cheaper than it was when it first came out, but it's very easy to get from them. And if you don't like to buy books in physical form, Apple Books and maybe others have it as a download as well.
All right, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Any other questions? We have about 10 minutes. There's another question from the Goldbergs. Don't forget to unmute.
Yep.
Yeah, you were talking about translations, and Robert Alter directed me to notice that the Hebrew of the last line of Psalm 22 and the English translation aren't the same, because the English is "I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever," and the Hebrew is "Kol Yamim," all my days. And we were doing, in a Greek reading class I belonged to, we just happened to be doing the Septuagint of Psalm 22. And lo and behold, they also say, "all my days," and not "forever." So at least they were in agreement 200 years BCE. But I found that you could stop a conversation at a dinner party by mentioning this, because people say, "Oh, it's the same." And I say, "No, it's not the same." "Oh, yes, it is," And don't you believe in life after death? It invariably comes back to that.
Well, I mean, that a very, very fair point. I suppose you could also say that in human terms, all my days is forever, because it's the only ever that any of us is going to know. But a very good point.
Struggling to unmute myself. We have a question from Louise.
Hi, hello. Hi, Charles.
Hi, literally my oldest friend.
Oh, getting older, yeah. That was really interesting, the history of the Psalms. I had no idea about the parallels with other cultures. And I've got another question on translation. I just wondered whether you'd actually studied some of these Psalms in their previous version before they came into being the Hebrew Psalms.
Well, yes, actually, when I was an undergraduate, I did a degree in ancient and medieval Hebrew with Aramaic and Syriac.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. So funnily enough, so do I as well. And one of the courses that we did as part of that degree was ancient Semitic epigraphy. And so we did look at some of the texts from other cultures, including a Ugaritic one. Of course, nobody knows how Ugaritic would have been pronounced. They just have the consonants. But finding precise phrases, God is called a cloud rider in one of the Psalms, and that exact phrase is attributed to Baal in one of the Ugaritic Psalms. And there is a marvelous collection called Documents of Old Testament Times, and another one called Ancient Near Eastern Texts. It sounds very dry and very scholarly, but they are a lot of different texts from ancient cultures around our own, translated into English. And there are some extraordinary texts there. I mean, never mind parallels with the Psalms. You'll find material like, for example, another version of what we would call the Joseph and Potiphar story. And you do get the sense that our literary tradition, while it had its own uniqueness, nevertheless was very much part of a general literary tradition. And of course, why would it have been any different, any more than it is in our own time? I mean, let's not worry about, modern communication. There is a cultural continuum which writers feed into and produce new things from, and then others feed into that. And exactly the same thing happened in the ancient world.
Yeah,
Charles, I've listed all the Psalms that you quoted, and I think that's given us all somewhere to start, because 150 is a lot. And there's also a reference there to the altar. Can I ask a quick question? It's about the ta'amim, it's about the musical notation, which we may notice around the words, although it looks rather different to how it's presented in the Torah. And I believe we don't know the tune. Do you know how it was, or the trope? Do you know any more about that?
No, I'm afraid to say, Nathan, that I don't. I would probably put our colleague Mark Solomon on the spot on that one. If anyone would know it, he would. There have been a lot of music composed for the Psalms, including some quite experimental music. And I remember some years ago, someone suggesting that they had a way of getting close to how things might have sounded in the temple. I'm afraid I'm too much of a skeptic to have much confidence in that. But then surely, if we have that absence, why not make it a virtue and create a new trope for the Psalms? Why not?
I think that's right. And when we were by the rivers of Babylon, I'm sure I wasn't the only one with Boney M in mind. So it never stops.
Indeed.
For better or worse.
And Don McLean.
All right, there's a good tip. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Who's going? No, Angela is the first hand I saw. So over to Angela. Don't forget to unmute. Don't forget to unmute. I'm going to just give you a little hint. You'll have to unmute. There we are. You're all ready to go.
Well, okay. If I asked you to summarize for me, in my ignorance, what particular contribution the Psalms had for the ethics of liberal Judaism, how would you respond?
And I'll give Charles a moment to compose his thoughts. So that will be our final thought. And we'll say thank you very much for a wonderful hour, which has kick-started a relationship with the Psalms if it ever ended. But I'll certainly be going back to that list. So Charles, please see us out with an answer.
Well, I think sometimes the answer is in what the Psalms say, but not just the bits that we are comfortable with and agree with, but with the parts that we profoundly disagree with. Because I think sometimes an ethical imperative comes from things you really feel uncomfortable about, not just from the things that are easily, you easily take them on board and you make them part of yourself. I think there are probably more aspects and verses and content of the Psalms that do resonate with modern liberal Judaism. And if I had to single out any type, I would single out the nature psalms, because I think all of us, certainly every liberal Jew, is well aware of the stakes at the moment in terms of the history of the world for my grandchildren and yours and theirs. And so the Psalms which glorify nature, but also which remind us of God's role in creation and the fact that we are not the be all and end all of everything, are really very, very healthy. And as I said, I think for me as a liberal Jew, a key thing is to feel grounded. And it's texts like that that really, really ground me. I'm really, really happy to see so many of you, some who I know and others who I don't. And I hope those of you who I don't know so well will forgive me for saying Cynthia, Ruth, David and Carla, Tony, Louise, Kathy, Celia. It's just lovely to see you on the screen. We all, in our different ways and different contexts, go back quite a long way. So thank you for being here, and thank all of you for being here. And when you next have a moment or two to spare, pick up a book of Psalms and give them a read.
Charles, thank you very much. And I think we can all show our appreciation one way or another on screen. And
thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if you could hold on for a minute, everyone, I'm just going to do a little plug for next week. So we've had a number of things, and some of you I'm sure have been here through all of these sessions. Next week is Rabbi Neil Janes, who teaches at the college on rabbinic literature. He's doing a session on rabbinic literature and its relevance to liberal Jewish values today. So we've had the prophets, we've had the Psalms and other things. Next week it's rabbinic literature with Rabbi Neil Janes, who is a great educator himself. So please do join him next week if you can. And great to see so many of you. And I really do see that Charles did not need an introduction, but I'm glad I was asked to give it nevertheless. So wish everyone good night.